If I ever tell you that there's only one correct way to read tarot, then you'll know I'm being held hostage. However, I do still think that a guidebook that tells you what the cards are supposed to mean can actually be more useful than one that doesn't. Today, we're going to reframe the tarot guidebook. We're going to talk about receiving versus making meaning, about structure versus intuition, and why I hate a little white book. Let's unpack. Here's my main point right up front. It almost doesn't matter what the guidebook actually says. It doesn't matter what it says the definition of a card is. What is useful and what I think makes a good guidebook is one that gives you something to calibrate your own readings against. It doesn't matter what it tells you, as long as it tells you something specific that you can have an opinion about. Then when you read the guidebook entry, you think it over, maybe you'll agree with it, maybe you'll think the complete opposite, but having the creator's intentions and opinions will help you to sharpen your readings and strengthen your own opinions about what the cards mean and how you personally interpret them. So the reframe that I want to make today is from guidebooks are the place you look for answers toward guidebooks are a document that tell you how to read the deck in front of you. And that is something that you can engage with, you can agree with, you can disagree with. We're going to talk about little white books in a minute, and I have a lot of opinions on those. But first, I want to just establish how I'm defining a good guidebook for the purposes of this video. So a good guidebook is one that breaks down why the creator made the choices they made with the cards. Maybe they've changed up symbols, maybe they've changed the suit names, they've changed up colors, they have introduced elements of the card that you don't typically see in a Rider-Waite-Smith, for instance, completely different scenes, different sort of actions, activities happening, so on and so forth. I want a guidebook that tells me why those changes have been made, why the creator decided to. For instance, I've got one where the strength card is a snake and a mouse. I want to know why those choices were made. That's what I think makes a good guidebook. Ultimately, I think a guidebook is a record of the interpretive decisions that were sort of encoded into the cards by the deck's creator. It's almost like a style guide or a style brief for the deck. And then that is something that you can, as a reader, meaningfully engage with. You can read that guide to the deck. You're not having to make your own assumptions. You know exactly what was intended by all this different symbolism. And then you can decide whether that makes sense for the way that you read, whether it's something that you agree with or not. Something I feel very strongly about is that meaning is something we make. It's not something we just passively receive from the cards. We don't look to the cards for straightforward answers. It's not like flashcards. And in the same way, I think a good guidebook is not just telling you what the cards mean, it's telling you why they mean what they mean, and then you can actually actively engage with that. You're not just going to the guidebook as like a reference guide for quick answers. It's not just card definitions, it's card explanations and explorations. And this is also why I like a guidebook that gives you like upright and reversed meanings or even shadow meanings. And this was something I mentioned in my last video about deck readability, what makes a deck readable. I talked a little bit about guidebooks, and actually this is kind of an extension of that video. But something I mentioned there is I think it's really useful when a deck tells you, for instance, upright versus reversed meanings. And I don't even read reversals typically, but I just think it's really useful when a creator has given you that framework. And in doing so, they have made explicit their own interpretation process. It's almost like reverse engineering how they interpret the cards through what they've portrayed and then how they suggest you interpret those cards. And when you are somebody like me who thinks a lot about your thinking, you think a lot about meaning making, you think a lot about how you get to the answers that you're getting out of the cards, like your own process of interpretation, that kind of thing in a guidebook is so valuable because it puts out on the page in black and white the creator's process of meaning making and how they have gone from the meaning to the card that you're looking at. And then when you as a reader are trying to do the opposite, when you're looking at the card and you're trying to draw the meaning out of it, you have this example from the creator and it gives you something concrete that you can, like I said, position yourself against, orient yourself either in alignment with, maybe you agree with what the creator is saying, maybe you're in opposition, maybe probably you're somewhere in the middle. There's things you agree with, there's things that you would have done differently. And this is also where I have a bit of a, not quite problem, but I disagree with the advice to just read intuitively, because first of all, I think people mean different things when they talk about intuition. The kind of intuition that I think a lot of people in this tarot space often talk about is the idea of a received, maybe channeled message, something that pops into your head, something that maybe you receive from a guide or some kind of higher wisdom, maybe your higher self, maybe your internal self. People phrase it in different ways, but that's what I'm talking about when I say I dislike the advice of just read intuitively, because that doesn't encourage you to engage with the structure of the deck that you're looking at. And obviously, when we get to a point where we've memorized card meanings, where we know what the cards mean to us, that might pop into your head before you've actually really looked at the card in front of you, or before you've read the guidebook. For instance, when I pick up an Emperor card, one of the first things I think about is the word boundaries and everything that means to me with the Emperor card before I've really actually started looking at the imagery or read the guidebook entry. So that definitely happens. But where I have an issue is where people might advise you to kind of stop there, or people who advise you to throw out the guidebook. And I'm like, babes, no, I paid for this. This is half of the deck. I would like to engage with the guidebook, please and thank you. I think perhaps the advice to trust your intuition and the you don't need a guidebook advice are actually quite similar in what they mean. They both treat the guidebook as an optional extra or something you ought to be able to graduate out of needing. I think what this perspective gets wrong about that is how it treats a tarot reading as just a way to receive meaning or receive an answer. You pick it up from the guidebook or you receive it intuitively rather than making meaning, which is what I think we're really doing when we read tarot. The guidebook is evidence for how the deck creator made their meaning, and that evidence is something you can keep engaging with, not something you need to just put aside once you feel confident with the tarot system. You've got the suits, you've got the majors, you've got the minors, you've got the quartz, you've got maybe numerology, elemental associations, whatever, but it also has really broken down how the creator has encoded that structure in the imagery. And when that includes things like upright and reverse positions, shadow meanings, some decks will tell you how to interpret cards for like a love reading, a career reading, or something like that. That is the structure of the deck. That's the structure of how to engage with the deck. And like I said, you can come to that guidebook, you can decide whether or not to agree with it, but having those different perspectives, and especially when you've got like different perspectives on the same card from the same author, if you pull this for a shadow reading, it means this thing. If you pull it for a love reading, it means this thing. It gives you additional ways of viewing the card, multiple additional ways of viewing the card, which I think, even if you disagree with all of it, helps you understand it better. So that is my case for why to read a guidebook like a tarot nerd. One more thing I want to touch on before we get into the how to read a guidebook is the idea of readable decks, since that's what inspired this video. The idea that a good deck is one that is readable without a guidebook is an opinion that I hear from a lot of people, and is probably something I've said myself, especially about decks that have really straightforward Rider-Waite Smithy imagery. So I did talk a bit about this in my recent video about what makes a readable deck, but I don't think I quite got into the idea of how readability, this idea of readability, translates to guidebooks and how we see guidebooks. Because, okay, here's the thing. If a good deck is a readable deck, and if a readable deck is one that you don't need a guidebook for, then that implies that a guidebook is only useful if you don't really know what you're doing. It implies that a guidebook is like an extra for when the deck isn't very good, or if you're a beginner, or if you need like a reminder on card meanings. And some people will even say that you should just throw the guidebook out entirely, or like just read intuitively, which we all know I would disagree with. So the point that I want to make is that a guidebook doesn't have to just be a reference for card meanings, because that reference is something that you can learn and internalize and apply to any deck. And like I've said, is usually what we mean when we talk about a deck that is easy to read. It is one where we can apply our own learned card meanings. It's familiar to the meanings that we already know. So the point that I want to make today is that a good guidebook can be used as evidence of how a deck is meant to be read or intended to be read, because it contains a record of the creator's intentions and the decisions they made when they were designing it, when they were translating their meanings into imagery. So a guidebook that gets into all that is something that you can engage with for its own sake. It's not just like a little extra to the cards. So the question isn't whether you need a guidebook, it's how you're going to use it. So first up, who is this guidebook written for? This is something that is not always stated in the guidebook itself, but it's definitely something you can ask and you can figure out. A guidebook that is written for a complete beginner is going to be done differently than one that is written for a reader who is already experienced. If there is a lot of foundational explanation, then maybe the creator is assuming that they're teaching you from scratch. On the other hand, maybe the deck assumes that you already have a foundation of how you read tarot, but this deck is introducing a new element or a new style of reading. For instance, the Darkwood Tarot pops to mind, which, if I remember correctly, has some like front matter that introduces it as a shadow deck and explains that it has that perspective throughout the imagery. Similarly, you can ask, what is this guidebook assuming about how you read? Does it assume you're reading for yourself, for clients? What does that tell you about the context the deck was designed for? And how are you going to adapt that in the readings that you actually perform with this deck? Another question I think is really worth asking is, does the guidebook just assert the meanings, or does it explain how they got there? So as I've already said, I prefer a guidebook that walks you through the meaning, that explains the symbolism, explains the artistic choices, explains what means what and why. A book that says the 5 of Wands means competition because everyone is hitting each other with sticks and everyone is getting hit is more useful to me than a book or a little white book that just says 5 of Wands competition, end of story. With the first one, you can follow that logic. You can see how they got to their keyword. You can see how they're defining competition, and you can see what that means, because it's not just that everybody's fighting, it's that nobody's winning. And then as you follow that, you can, agree or come to a different conclusion, or maybe you think other factors are more important. It gives you more to work with. Another question I think is really important to ask is, where does this meaning come from? I talk about this all the time. Tarot is a system of systems. There's astrology, there's numerology, there's Kabbalah, there's elements, there's all sorts. If those influences are stated in the guidebook, then it gives you more information about how well that deck is going to align with your style of reading and how useful you're going to find the guidebook, quite frankly. It's kind of like citing sources. So, for instance, the Wheel of Fortune, a guidebook that just says Wheel of Fortune equals expansion has very limited usefulness. A book that says the Wheel of Fortune means expansion because it's associated with Jupiter, which is the largest planet in our solar system and is associated with ideas of abundance. Therefore, the Wheel of Fortune means expansion. That's more useful, right? And so you read that and you think, okay, I actually don't give a shit about astrology. So maybe that's not very useful to you, but you do like the keywords, so you decide to keep it. Maybe not. But otherwise, you just don't know if the card meaning is based in a system you don't use. You also don't know if it's just the creator's personal opinion, which is fine in and of itself. We all have opinions. That's what a deck is, right? A deck is a creator's specific vision of the tarot. But if the guidebook doesn't tell you where these ideas have come from, you might be a little more cautious about taking those meanings forward into your other readings or the work you do with other decks. A guidebook is so much more than just a list of card definitions. And what I hope to leave you with today is the idea that a guidebook is evidence of how someone moved from meaning to imagery. And when we come to it as readers, we can retrace that back and find where we would agree with the route that the creator took and where we might go somewhere different. With this in mind, I hope you'll agree that a good guidebook is one that is specific enough to give you something to have an opinion about. And maybe that's been the point that I've really been trying to make: how to read a guidebook critically, like how you might read any other book or piece of writing critically. You want to have opinions about it. You want to be able to push back and ask questions and engage with the text. If you want to put this kind of thinking into practice, then I think you would fit right in over in the Tarot Lab on my Patreon. Every month we establish something about the tarot structure and then we explore it and test it. The link is in the description if you're interested. If you want to stay here on YouTube, I think you will also enjoy the video that I made earlier this year about my tarot book collection and like the different categories of books and what I use them for. That's it from me. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for spending some time with me. Let me know what you thought down in the comments. Let me know your favorite guidebooks. Always looking for more recommendations. But yeah, give this one a like if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.